All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet. We've got Chapter 16, Section 2, European Expansion 1400 to 1550. So European expansion in particular, and we had mentioned this last chapter, because of what happens in 1492 with the voyage of Christopher Columbus. And the reason why Columbus's voyage is so significant in world history is that it ends Old World / New World isolation. And that isolation had lasted approximately 15,000 years. So to end the isolation between people in Europe, Asia, and Africa, the Old World, with North and South America is a monumental historical event. And so the question is, well, how did Columbus come to this? Because we learned in the last section, 16-1, that there's a lot of maritime expansion going on. Why then was it Columbus? Why was it an Italian sailing on behalf of the Spanish crown? So what made European expansion possible was a mixture of motives and technology. Right, motives and technology. In terms of what motivated Europe to go looking beyond its borders, included four things actually. We'll talk about it here. A revival or revived urbanization and trade. We talked a little bit about how this was the ending of the quote-unquote dark ages, that global trade rose, thanks to empires like the Mongols. So all throughout Europe, and in fact, around the world, populations were recovering, cities were becoming much more active in terms of economic output, trade was increasing, and this allowed for more resources to be available to go out and explore overseas. In Europe in particular, there were alliances between merchants and rulers, which of course allowed for rulers to utilize the resources from merchants, and merchants to go out and sail on behalf of rulers. Christopher Columbus, for example, was part of this alliance. What made his voyage possible was the Spanish monarch. In fact, it was the Spanish monarch who gave Christopher Columbus the money that was required to build 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, and go out and sail into the Atlantic Ocean. This was occurring in a lot of other places in Europe at the time. There's also strong religious motives, specifically related to Christianity and Islam. Europe in, about the year, we'll say 1100 CE to roughly 1300 CE, was at war with the Islamic world through a series of wars called the Crusades. And so this desire for holy war, specifically to recapture the Holy Land, which is modern day Jerusalem, did help motivate some of these European merchants, or probably more appropriately, European rulers who were seeking either maybe a different path to reach Jerusalem or to carry out more warfare against their Muslim rivals, and also just a general curiosity about what was out there. So in terms of motivations, why? Well, we can put a couple of different motivations at play here. Again, revive urban and trade, merchant-ruler alliances. We might just boil this down to it's all about the money. Of course, there's a profit motive, there's a religious motive, and there's a curiosity motive. We might just say, this could be an intellectual curiosity or even an economic curiosity about the rest of the world. The most active economic place at the particular time period, or we'll say approximately 1400-ish, was northern Italy, but they really dominated trade along the Mediterranean. So in northern Italy, there were city-states like Venice. Actually, let me go ahead go. Venice. And this trade that revolved around northern Italy and the Mediterranean really made no reason to seek trade elsewhere. So even though city-states like Venice were the most active in trading at the time, and they traded in the Mediterranean Sea, because they had already made a pretty good amount of profit, there was no reason to really seek this trade elsewhere. Instead, the real exploration comes from the Iberian Peninsula, which is a geographic area consisting of the countries of Portugal and Spain. And of these two nations, it's really Portugal that is the pioneer of this overseas expansion. So Portuguese voyages really were, or in part, occurred because of Prince Henry the Navigator, who, as a prince, you might imagine what his father or mother's occupation was. And what he did was he dedicated resources to maritime exploration and we'll say and knowledge, right? Things like map making, shipbuilding, the type of navigation technology that might be necessary in order to sail. And so it was Prince Henry the Navigator's, he established schools. He actually didn't go on any voyages himself, but he simply just kind of invested in it and made it possible. He was also partially motivated by the Crusades. That was to declare war on Muslims, both Portugal and Spain being primarily Christian kingdoms at the time. With this motivation of wanting to seek out both economic goods and this religious motivation, there were a few technological advancements that made this exploration possible. First of all was the magnetic compass. The magnetic compass, if you're not entirely familiar with a compass, it's that device that where you open up, it has a needle on it, and it'll always point towards the north. This was something, in fact, invented in China, but the technology spread to Europe, making exploration and sailing in the open water that is away from land possible. The ship that the Portuguese used was the caravel. This was a smaller, maybe more, maybe agile. That's how you spell AG. Let's see real quick. AGILE, a more agile type of ship that allowed for navigation both along the coastline and specifically up rivers. Think about this in comparison to the Chinese junk ship or treasure ship, which was just so massive it could not really navigate in shallow waters or navigate up rivers like the caravel could. What made this navigation possible were lateen sails. A lateen sail is a triangular sail. It allows you to sail against the wind as opposed to the standard square sail that Europeans had used up until that time. This was a technology that also spread to Europe. This was initially invented in the Middle East. So in both cases, we see that with the compass and with the triangular sail, two technologies that made Portuguese exploration possible were actually invented outside of Europe and only spread there. One of the different approaches or things that the Portuguese used was cannon, and this really allowed the Portuguese to fight off their rivals much better than anyone else at the time. Cannon was not a common feature on ships before the Portuguese, and this really gave them an upper hand against many of their rivals. Now, initially when these voyages sent out, the Portuguese, which if you can look at this map here, Portugal would be located about right here, the southern tip of Portugal. Initially, these explorations established fortifications along the coast of Africa, and it was trade with Africa that allowed for Portuguese exploration to continue. African gold provided more motives to continue exploring. Whereas we saw in the case of the Ming Dynasty in China, their overseas exploration along the Indian Ocean didn't really yield enough profit to continue those voyages. The Portuguese, with gold and other trade goods from Africa, have reason to continue their exploration, and in fact do continue their exploration. Also amongst the economic commodities the Portuguese find is also sugar. The Portuguese plant sugar on the island of Sao Tome. This is an island in the Atlantic. Sugar is a very profitable crop. All right, we'll put some dollar signs here. And the most important thing about the sugar plantations on Sao Tome is the labor. And the labor that was used is African slavery. And here we're beginning to get a kind of a preview of one of the major world historical developments, and that is the origins or the birth of the African slave trade, because it's ultimately this combination of sugar and African slavery that makes its way to the Caribbean island, or the islands, right? The same system. Portugal continues their explorations along the African coast. In fact, this map right here is an early map that the Portuguese established, essentially establishing bases along the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast is located right here. The Portuguese built various factories that could trade in various commodities, including gold, slaves, and other trade goods that were in Africa at the time. And so this continued exploration led to eventually the Portuguese sailing around Africa, which was a major accomplishment. Both Bartholomew Diaz and Vasco da Gama, these are both Portuguese, or at least sailing on behalf of Portugal. They might actually be born somewhere else. But sailing on behalf of Portugal at the very least. Bartholomew Diaz was the first to round the southern tip of Africa. In other words, it was unknown at the time if you could even sail around Africa, if there was a navigable waterway, underneath it. Diaz discovered that yes, in fact, it was. Vasco da Gama was important because he was the first European to reach India by boat. He made it all the way around Africa from Europe to India. And one of the reasons why that was important was because India and places like China, specifically the East, had very rich trade goods. Right, very rich trade goods. Here you see a picture of Vasco da Gama's caravel ship. The lateen sail, the triangular sail in the back that allows the ship to sort of navigate and sail against the water. So we got a map here, and we can kind of take a look at these explorations. So here in the green, anyways, you're going to see Vasco da Gama's trip. Again, he was the first one to go all the way around and end up in India. That was significant. He came back with a profit of like 4,000% or so. So that was really significant. So Portugal had found, something that, and to get back to the point about religious conflict, the Portuguese did fight it out with Muslim rulers, in this area of the Arabian Sea. So there were, conflicts, here that could satisfy maybe that crusading impulse, whereas places like India, that was really where a lot of the profit was made for Portugal, being able to turn investments on specifically things like spices, which were in very high demand back home. Now that leads us to the Spanish voyages and ultimately to Christopher Columbus, because I'd said at the very beginning, this is really the significant turning point in world history, given just the sheer consequence of what Christopher Columbus's voyage did, and that was to end 15,000 years of isolation between the Old World and the New World. Again, looking at this map to get a better idea, the Old World includes essentially all of this, and the New World is this. And again, before Columbus, those two were isolated for quite some time. Spain, unlike Portugal, was a little bit late to the maritime expansion parties, so to say. They were involved with a reconquest of the southern Iberian Peninsula. Iberia, again, to get a reference in terms of where it is geographically, it is this area right here. And for a very long time, in fact, for around 700 years in southern Iberia, I'll say 700 years, Christian and Muslim rulers were engaged in a very long and drawn-out war. And finally, in the 1490s, really on the eve of Christopher Columbus, the Christian forces push off or expel the last Muslim rulers from the Iberian Peninsula back across I think the Strait of Gibraltar there to northern Africa and what is Morocco. And this was reason for the Spanish crown to form, right? So it was the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, which led to the modern Spanish state or the Spanish Empire. Spain looking to get a leg up on Portugal. Portugal's already made significant inroads in African trade and are surely on their way to India. Vasco da Gama hasn't quite made it there yet. The Spanish crown takes a risk on Christopher Columbus, who claims he can make a trip to India, essentially, going a shorter way. Essentially, Columbus's view, or Columbus's gamble, you might say, is that he can sail from Spain going this way and end up here. Of course, Columbus's big blunder, or the knowledge that he doesn't know, is that there is an entire continent that exists right in this region. According to Columbus, the world is much smaller than it actually is. Contrary to the popular myth, it wasn't the fear that the world was flat. Really, the thing that made Columbus different was his belief the world was smaller and that he could simply just sail west and end up in India or in China and gain access to those very valuable trade goods. Of course, what Columbus did instead was take a trip west and land right in these islands right here, right? The Caribbean islands is eventually where Columbus lands. So let's go ahead and fill out a little bit of this thing here, right? So Columbus sailed on behalf of Spain. His motive was riches in the east, so maybe we'll write motive. That's why he sailed the way that he did. Of course, what he actually did was to end isolation between Old World and the New World. He landed in the Caribbean, so this is Columbus's landing spot. And he came into contact with, of course, the people there, Native Americans or American Indians. Refer to them as Indians, which is a term that has since stuck. And really went to his deathbed believing that he had actually landed in Asia. He didn't quite realize exactly what he had discovered. Other people in Europe realized that, no, in fact, this wasn't India. This was, in fact, something completely new. The explorer Amerigo Vespucci was one of the early explorers to recognize this was new territory or new continents. This is where we get the term America from. So North and South America are named after Vespucci rather than Columbus, right? Not North and South Colombia, but North and South America. And this put, Columbus's discovery of whatever this was, put Spain and Portugal into a rivalry with one another that required a treaty. The Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, was a treaty between Spain and Portugal over maritime expansion. Essentially, the Spanish and the Portuguese were rivals, but they had discovered different things, essentially. Portugal was pretty satisfied with the trade that da Gama found to the east that could yield a lot of profit. Spain was pretty satisfied. They didn't exactly know what they were going to do with this new territory, but there was potentially profit there. And so the Treaty of Tordesillas was a line that divided the world in half. Let's see if we can get a new color here. Let's try pink. Was a line that divided the world in half. And here's the line right here. Yeah, you can definitely see that. And so this treaty stated that anything on this side of the line would go to Spain, and anything on this side of the line would go to Portugal. All right, that's not really that clear, but whatever, that's what we got. And this served as a way to keep Spain and Portugal out of each other's overseas affairs. Essentially, it's significant for a lot of reasons. One is it explains some of Portugal's dominance in Indian Ocean trade. They don't have to compete with the Spaniards there. But maybe most importantly, it explains how Spain really can go unchecked or goes unchecked in the Americas to establish a Spanish empire there. One last thing to mention, that is Ferdinand Magellan. He is the explorer that is credited for making the first, what we might call round the world voyage. You can see his voyage here in red. Even though Magellan actually died en route, he is often credited, this way, as being the first person to sail around the world. And, for, some practical purposes, Magellan's voyage around the world kind of brings a conclusion to this European age of exploration.